Hey everybody, how you doing? This is year number 3 for me with this crew. Who was here last year when I spoke, by a show of hands? By a show of hands, how many remember anything I had to say? All right, so I might recap a little bit of that so that we can get into this, but I'm still shaking from being back there and hearing them mention Netflix and chill. I have teenage daughters. And recently, I coach my daughters on this idea that boys suck. And they're smelly, they stink, they have no redeeming value, especially at their age. They have no money, they have no car, they have no interest in asking you questions about your life. And they only care about one thing, and that's one thing you can't do. And one of my daughters said, "Dad, you know, you're right. All boys want to do is Netflix and chill." I'm like, well, at least they don't want to party. She's like, "You don't understand. That means watch movies and have sex." And so I changed the passcode on my Netflix and put a lock on my home theater. So there will be no Netflix and chilling in my house. So if you have teenagers that are using that vernacular around you, you have to ask another question. That's all I'm saying. That is free for you today. That wasn't in the script or anything. Just giving you that one. All right. So last year I spent a lot of time talking about insights that incite. The idea that you want to create more than just excitement and likes. You want people to actually take action. I'm going to recap a little bit of that, but where I'm going with it this year is this idea that why people should change and why they should do something different and why they should choose you is part of the equation. The other part of the equation is why should they stick around? Why should they renew? Why should they stay loyal? And that's the part we did some new original research on this year that I want to introduce to you. I've been told by my team I have to put this slide up here. Look at the bottom where it says tweet at CorpV, C-O-R, Peter Victor, CorpV, at CorpV. If you tweet on anything I say today, they're going to be monitoring that. And those lucky 20 or so, I saw books out there as you walked here, apparently get copies of the last 2 books that I've written if your tweet is then chosen. So you get a chance to tweet while we're going here today and a chance to win. And then we'll meet you out there at that little booth you walk past to get you your books. Also, if you want to stop by, we'll scan you and we'll get all these slides because there's a lot of research I'm going to show you. It's going to happen pretty fast, and I want to make sure you get this information. So this is our story this year. Customer acquisition and why change is an important part of our job. New logo acquisition, net new demand, but also the other part of the life cycle. I was recently at a presentation, and somebody from a very large technology company came to me and said, "My biggest problem is that in China, we have only a 10% renewal rate. If I could just get that to 15%, I'd blow my number out of the water. That's where my problem is." 90% non-renewal rate for this technology company's software. So we know that there's a story there. We know there's an opportunity there. But the question is, do we know what to do about it, and are we doing anything about it? So what I need to do first and foremost, though, is take you back to last year. So this is like the recap. When, you know, a series ends, and then they come back in the fall, and they show you, last year on Big Bang Theory, you had this. So this is what I did last year. I told you about the challenge called the status quo. That when prospects engage with you and they move through the funnel, the presumption is they want to change. They want to do something. They're a live opportunity. Then sales gets a hold of it, qualifies it in the pipeline, only to find out that 60% of the pipeline goes to no decision status quo. Literally 60% on average of your qualified pipeline, not even top of the funnel MQLs and SALs, qualified pipeline ends up in making no decision. So the majority of the people that you're talking to are in a different place than you think they are. Many companies go in once there's a lead and you start trying to tell them about why they should choose you and not your competitors. And you build competitive matrices and all these other things. You know the competitive matrix, right? We have you and your competitors, and then you have all the features and all the benefits, and then you give yourself full moons and your competitors half moons. And then you say, we win, we have more full moons. Well, it turns out that 60% of the people who are actually talking to your sales force, leads that you generated, don't care about you, whether you are better than the competition. The reason they stick with the status quo is they have not answered this question. Why should I even change? Why should I do anything different? The installed competitor is inertia, not your named arch rival. Because they're not seeing it as you against the competitor that you see in their company. They're seeing it as you against them not wanting to change. And if they don't have to, they won't. So what we talked about is that the companies who win the majority of the business from Forrester Research has been identified as those folks who create the buying vision versus those people who come in and show up and win in a competitive bake-off. You had a 3 in 4 chance of winning if you help inspire the decision to change. You have a 1 in 4 chance if you show up later when there's an active sort of cycle going on. So what that identified was if you can be the company who has the why change conversation, you convince them that their status quo is no longer as safe and secure and solid as possible, now has some leaks and some squeaks in it, you're the one who can win more than your fair share of the business. So last year we introduced you to a framework based on the status quo bias. This is scientifically proven that you, me, and all of your customers live in something called status quo bias. And there's 4 anchors, if you will, that keep people from changing. And your messages actually have to attack those 4 anchors. The first is preference stability. When I made this decision, I wanted to stabilize it. I established some preferences, and now this is where I want to stay. The reality is if you want somebody to change and you want to acquire a new piece of business and a new logo, you have got to introduce messaging and content that destabilizes their current preferences. Literally helps them see that what they decided when they decided it is no longer relevant because things are changing in their environment, and as a result, there are some needs, challenges, threats, problems, missed opportunities they didn't even know about in order to destabilize their preferences. I also told you about this idea that people believe the status quo is free. The decision that they made is now just part of their operating cycle, it's part of their process. The burden is on the change to justify and rationalize with an ROI why they should make the effort. There's this perceived cost on the change. So people are trying to figure out, should I change? But gosh, it's going to cost me. I got to get more people on board. I've got to go for it, find some extra budget. I'm going to be paying off this to all my friends and trying to gain consensus. I'm going to waste a lot of stomach lining. There's a lot of burden on the change. So the reality is people are stuck here because they believe this is free, and that's the thing that costs. The reality is if you message to cause people to change, you've actually need to show them the cost of staying the same, that there's some flaws and shortcomings and struggles and missed opportunities in their current approach that are actually costing them, so that the burden of the cost justification isn't on the change, there's a cost of staying the same. So I taught you that part of the messaging framework last year. Now I'm going through this quickly. Again, if you come by our booth, we'll send you a link to a video of this entire discussion so that you can pick up on it. But I need this as a level set. The third challenge is called selection difficulty. There's just so much information coming at me that everything looks, smells, sounds the same. It's so hard to decide anymore. And since everything looks, sounds, and smells the same, it would just be way easier to stay here, because why would I make a change to do something that's more or less the way I'm doing it today? Why would I take on that entire sort of risk effort if something's more or less the same as what I'm doing today? And we talked about your story. I showed you a study last year, the power of contrast, being able to show them how their current state and your recommended future state has enough contrast in there for them to see the value. You come in with your story and don't compare or contrast it to the way they're doing things today, very hard for them to discern the value. In fact, preference stability kicks in and they go, that's kind of like I'm doing it today. You show them enough contrast between what challenges, risks, problems, threats, missed opportunities are happening in their current state. You show them the future state. There's contrast. They can see value. Absent contrast, they just have a difficult time seeing why they should make the move for incremental potential opportunity. And finally, human beings are great. The fourth reason they stick with the status quo. After deciding that their preferences are supposed to be stable and you pique their interest. After determining that that costs a lot of money, I think I'll just stay here, and now you showed them there's a cost to staying the same. And now you've created enough contrast between your future state recommendation and their current state, you think you have them. Then this kicks in, anticipated regret and blame. Human beings are great. We can project into the future and go, yeah, I know what's going to happen. I'm going to stick my neck out. I'm going to take the risk. I'm going to lead the way. And everybody's going to blame me when this doesn't work. So they actually govern and decide it's just not worth it. And your messaging needs to contain sort of a before and after hero story. People are most persuaded when they self-persuade. And they self-persuade when they see someone who look like them, struggling and dealing with what they're dealing that sounds and looks and feels similar. And they see someone else who looks like them, then make this journey and do it with you and end up on this side successfully. This is a recipe right here for the why change story model. And that's what I gave you last year. Insights that will incite people to change must attack the 4 causes of status quo bias. You must introduce an unconsidered need that they didn't even know about. Voice of the customer research that identifies the things they know, and then you respond to the things they know, does not persuade someone to move. I am not persuaded when I'm certain, and I'm certain I told you all those things. I'm persuadable when I'm uncertain. So you must introduce an unconsidered need they hadn't expected to destabilize their preferences. Then you must show them the flaw in their current approach. What's the cost of staying the same? If you stay here, what possibly could happen? And how ugly could that get? And then in contrast, you show them the contrasting new way of doing things that seals those leaks, that fixes those flaws, and they see enough contrast to say, that makes some sense. And then you tell a before and after story with contrast of someone who looks and sounds just like them, in order to get them over that anticipated regret and blame. There is the why change story model. If you're doing top of the funnel demand gen, new business development, this is your model. And I spent last year's 50 minutes with you detailing this thing. And I can send that to you if you'd like. But I need to pivot now and get you to the rest of the story. Sorry, I got to give you a few results. Real quick, what I showed you last year, the why change story. The unconsidered need, if introduced in your messaging, will differentiate you and make you more unique in the marketplace. What I mean by standard solution that we tested is this idea that if you just talk about the needs the customer identified and knows about, and then speak to how you solve for that, they don't see enough difference between you and anybody else, and you're not seen as unique or different. If you answer the needs they identified in voice of the customer research or diagnostic discovery, and you just show them what you are capable of doing, but then you throw in a few value-added capabilities for differentiation, you are not seen as different and unique, because that's what everybody's trying to do. And all you're doing is just overloading them with more information. You can only differentiate in a powerful way, at least gain a 50% lift in altitude of differentiation, if you tell them something they didn't already know. And the most powerful you're going to find when it comes to them judging you versus your competitors and perceiving you as a higher quality vendor or partner is if you introduce that unconsidered need first. That's why our framework has that first. You are seen as you're seen as different and a higher quality potential partner if you tell them something they didn't already know about a problem they didn't know they had first. In fact, you're more persuasive. When people were forced in our study to make choices and choose vendors over other vendors based on the presentations that they saw, the ones that had the unconsidered need first gave them almost a 11% lift in persuasive power. Your why change story must introduce an unconsidered need, tell them about a flawed approach, and show them a new contrasting way, and then share a success story. That's the simple formula, and that's the research behind it, and that's how you move out and tell these stories. So what became really interesting to us then is that many of the people we talk to, and we work with about 150 companies every year, came to us and they said, that's really well and good when we have to defeat the status quo, and the status quo is our real competitor. What happens when we're the status quo? And I'm like, that is a great question. And then we started fumbling around for an answer, and what I discovered is all we had was opinions. We didn't have any data. We didn't have any research. And I don't like sharing opinions. I like testing these things. We work with professors of persuasion and negotiations at Stanford to run these studies and put people in these simulations and see how they respond. We actually watch how potential customers respond. We don't watch salespeople and how they behave. We want to see how customers make decisions. And so we said, you know what? That makes a lot of sense. Because in the renewal area, that's where you're finally going to start making your money. All the time and effort and cost you put into the change message and the change effort and the acquisition of customers really starts to come back at that first renewal. Because those first couple years, you might even over-service them to make them satisfied and happy. This is your opportunity. So what happens when you are the status quo? This becomes a very exciting part of the buying or life cycle of the customer, but what we're going to find out is a somewhat neglected part of the life cycle of the customer when it comes to you all in the room and the job you do. So we went back to this idea of when you want to defeat the status quo, replace the status quo, you need to do these 4 things. When you are the status quo, should you continue to do these things? Should you be continuing to provoke the customer, bring them that new, fresh idea, whip some extra insight on them, challenge them to think differently, and use this formula? Or is it possible when you're the status quo, it would be more effective to actually reinforce these things? Literally go in and say, reinforce their preference stability because their current preference is for you, so you should deliberately reinforce that. The cost of change, a competitor's trying to come in, you want to reinforce the cost that they invested and sunk and now is just running like a clock, and look at this over here and help them see maybe that's where the cost lies, right? Reinforce the cost effectiveness of the status quo. And maybe you should reinforce selection difficulty. We thought maybe it's possible that when you are the status quo, the smartest thing you could say is, we're more or less the same as everybody else. When all our life we've been taught to be different, potentially in this moment, the most important thing you could say is, we're not. Because if we're not, why would you take the risk of change? This is our hypothesis, right? And then the before and after story, instead of anticipated regret and blame and trying to show them that they won't have any regret if they make a move and do something different, maybe we want to help them sort of fuel the flames of that. What regret and blame might you have if you decide to change? So this was the hypothesis. We thought we should test this because there's a lot of push out there to say that the insight, provocation, challenging message is the way we need to talk to customers. But is it true at renewal time? So we created a test, a simulation, where we recruited over 400 people, college educated, average age 38.76, which is getting younger every year, and told them this is the simulation, right? It was 51% male, 49% female. So we recruited these people and we put them in this simulation. You have to imagine you're a small business owner. You are the small business owner and you hired a firm. And you were struggling with employee turnover and satisfaction. And your goal as the owner of this company was to get more people to opt into your retirement program, because what you heard is people who are involved in the retirement program are more engaged, more satisfied, and it actually reduces turnover. So you hired a firm who specializes in this to come in and up the enrollment in your retirement program. And what we told them is you started at 20% enrollment before they came. Your goal was to hit the world-class level of 80%. And what has happened here in the last 2 years with this firm, since you've partnered with them, they've got you to 50%. We didn't want to make this renewal obvious. We wanted to leave potential room. But you've seen turnover go down and satisfaction go up. And there's a correlation. You're not sure if it's causation. In the simulation, we reminded them they did a very thorough investigation when they decided on this firm. They put all the vendors through their paces to choose this one. And then we said, now it's renewal time, and you're going to hear a message from your current vendor about why you should renew your contract and subscription for the next 2 years. And then what they didn't know is we put them into 3 groups, one of 3 groups. Some of them heard a provocative message, which I'll show you, which introduced an unconsidered need and did everything that you might think would be the right thing to do to keep it spicy and keep the sizzle alive. Another group heard a provocative message and were told that this is something new you could do, but it might cost you a little extra money. So the first one heard about some new stuff, and I'll show you this, and not only was it new, but we were going to, if you signed up for the next 2 years, we're just going to throw that in. This one we wanted to see if we could charge a little more. And then the third group heard effectively a reinforce the status quo message, using the 4 status quo biases and reinforcing them as opposed to trying to provoke or disrupt them. So we divided that 400 group into 3 groups. You following me so far? So what I want to show you, and it's going to be a little harder to see, I'm going to walk you through the scripts that these people heard and saw the story unfold before them in the presentation. And again, you can get these slides from us if you stop by our little booth. In the provocative message, so hang in there, they basically heard this. The opening paragraph documented the business results and success that we've had together for the first 2 years. Opened with this idea that your participation rates went from 20 to 50%, your satisfaction scores up, your turnovers are down. These were your ultimate goals, and you started to see significant progress in that direction. Then, we introduced an unconsidered need, a disruptive, provocative challenge to their current thinking. Hey, that's great progress, but what we're seeing in many companies is it really is harder to go that last mile, to go from 50 to 80 than it was to go from 20 to 50. And what we're seeing out in the marketplace, and the latest research is saying, you might not be aware of this latest research, is that the companies that are really moving the needle and achieving world-class status at 80% are using a whole different approach. Instead of improving communications and getting people to opt in, they're using an opt-out method by automatically enrolling people in the 401k and then asking them if they want to stay or go. We think this is a new possibility for you to achieve your world-class goals. So let's do that. Now, it's going to take a different sort of system and some other programming, which costs a little extra money, but if you sign up for the next 2 years, we're just going to eat that cost, and we're going to hit this world-class goal together. So we actually reduced the perceived cost of change. We were trying to keep them from believing that, gee, we were trying to make this as fair as possible. All we altered was we introduced an unconsidered need and some new capabilities to deliver that. The ones that heard the upsell, this last paragraph simply told them that this was going to result in an increase of 4% in their subscription, but it was going to be worth it because you were going to hit your world-class numbers. The group that heard when we tried to reduce their anticipated regret and blame, because we said that other companies are doing this. So again, we tried to really tamp this down, say this is not a big risk. All that's happening is this new idea, this fresh insight, this provocative, unconsidered need. The next group then, we reinforced the status quo. So there was group one, provocative pitch, no upsell, roll the money in if you renew now. Second group is provocative pitch, but we told them it's going to cost them 4% more. And now this group who saw this message, we did the same thing. We opened reporting on the progress, same exact information as the other groups. So the documented results were the exact same thing. But then we systematically walked them through the status quo bias, deliberately reinforcing, in this case, preference stability. Hey, when you signed up 2 years ago, you really did your homework. And we went down sort of a memory lane stroll to remind them, frankly, of how frickin' hard it was 2 years ago. The process they went through, the consensus they had to build, the number of people involved, the lift that it created, the distraction from their day job. But we did it in a nice, friendly, wasn't that a great time we all had together sort of thing. And then remind them that they're making great progress and that there's an opportunity, the trajectory is up and to the right. Then we reinforce the perceived cost of change by telling them any change to this program at this point might put an unnecessary burden or risk on the program. Like there's a risk of losing positive gains when you stop to do something different or change out or swap processes or partners or vendors. And there were a lot of sunk costs that you did. There were startup costs, there was training, there was process change, there were a lot of things you did 2 years ago that if you do anything different, effectively you'd have to rinse and repeat that. Pretty much saying you really want to do that. And then we reinforce selection difficulty. We literally said the words, not to mention that bringing in another company that does something similar to us, we literally accepted and said, more or less, we're all the same. Somewhat counterintuitive to say that, but that was the pitch. And then we reinforced anticipated regret and blame. We help them see that potentially how critical their journey is, where they are, and they don't want to risk it. So we took and attacked all 4 of the status quo biases. So what happened? Here's what happened. Those people who watched and listened to the reinforce the status quo condition reported being significantly more positive about their vendor than those that heard the provocative story. There was almost a 10% improvement in the attitudes, how I feel about my partnership, how I feel about the partner, how I feel about the solution. So there's all kinds of questions underneath this. But the reality is, at renewal time, you can get a 10% increase in people's positive attitudes towards you by actually reinforcing these 4 common causes of status quo bias. That you get less potential positive attitudes if you start to stir the pot. Then we ask questions about your intentions to renew. This is where it got really interesting. Based on what you heard, remember they were each in separate groups, they weren't comparing them. The ones who were in the reinforce the status quo bias were 13.3% more likely to renew. You actually had a lower interest level in renewing from those you were telling and sharing something new with. I think it goes without saying that the provocative message with the upsell and the price increase was their least favorable. Which brings me to a point. Next year when I come back, this quarter we're running a new study called Not Why Change, Not Why Stay. We're running a new study called Why Pay. And we're going to figure out the framework for communicating a price increase. Because after we got done with this research, customers were like, yeah, but we want to get a price increase. And we're like, that's another good point. So we're working on that study this quarter. Watch out for that news coming. But here's the bottom line. You can statistically significantly improve the intention to renew by actually reinforcing their status quo bias, the psychology of status quo bias. Now watch this one. The likelihood of switching. So it's a different way of asking the question. But what we discovered is that the likelihood of switching goes up by almost 11% when you try to provoke a customer at renewal time. Why is this important? Because at some point, when customers are your customer and you're trying to renew them, the last thing you want to do is create an opportunity for someone else to get in there. And it turns out that when you introduce provocation at the moment of renewal, you actually increase the possibility that they might switch or would be less likely to renew. At least that's what the study showed us. So then we asked Professor Tormala, why do you think that is? And his point was, you've introduced uncertainty. And when uncertainty is introduced, then people are more open to being persuaded. So if you're going to change the game on me and there's this new thing you're talking about, how am I to be sure that you're the one who does that the best? You're just the one who was able to tell me about it first. So it creates opportunity to bring in others, because if we're going to have to change stuff anyways, why wouldn't I consider other people if I have to go through that? So then the challenge really became, but what if we want to get them to do some of these new things with us? When should we talk about that? Talk about it in the middle of the contract when the renewal is not on the line. Go in there and have a QBR, talk about the new things you're working on, share some new insights and ideas, but the moment of renewal is not the time to introduce your insight. It is not the time to provoke your customer or challenge them to do something different. It actually increases the likelihood they're like, oh, we might as well throw this thing open. So, in actuality, when you're delivering a why stay message, it is the antithesis of your why change message, and that it deliberately needs to reinforce the status quo bias. So what we wanted to do next then is we did another test. And we wanted to create a framework like the Why Change framework, which now gives you a tested and proven way of structuring your acquisition message. We said we need a structured and tested way to tell a renewal message, to construct and deliver a renewal message. And so the question for me became, how do we structure this, and in what order do we tell this story? Because that can be important. So we created all kinds of conditions using the status quo bias, the documenting of results, and a couple other things I'm about to show you, and we tested them in different orders. And we were able to identify a winning framework where people were more interested in renewing than some of the other orders that we tried things in. So I want to give you today your Why Stay framework, the one you can use when you're going to renewals and you want to structure a message that keeps that customer. That 90% that are not renewing, that could really make your number if you could get 5%, 10% more to do that. So we created a framework test. Don't freak out when I show you this, because I'm going to break it down for you. So this is the story they heard and they were reading. And this is the winning one. There were multiple constructs, like I said, but the winning one came in this order. And effectively, this is your model. And then I'm going to go back and walk you one thing at a time through to teach you the model. So the model is open with documenting your results. What are the measurements that you've been tracking for the last 2 years against the objectives that you set together, and open by recapping the results over the last 2 years? We tried putting documented results in the middle. We tried putting it at the end, but we got a statistically significant improvement in people's reaction in the form when it was the first thing they heard. So it's called the anchoring effect. Anchor them on the documented results and success you've had to date so they see progress, and it's always hard to stop progress. That's what we did in the model here, where we opened by, we use the same language. This is what you've seen. You've moved from 20 to 50%. Your employee satisfaction scores are up. You've even said some employees have taken time to thank you for the changes. In addition, your retention rates are up. The metrics, the goals you identified together with us have all seen some positive increases. We didn't maybe hit your ultimate number, but there is progress. The second part of it is then this idea of reviewing the prior decision. We discovered that you can pivot from there and say, this is the progress we've made over the last 2 years. Let's just walk together through, for a time, briefly, what we went through together to get to that point. And literally structured a brief moment where you recapped the decision they took 2 years ago and the effort they made 2 years ago to make this choice. So this success you've had was after a very long effort to establish some new preferences, and this is your preference, that's implied. And it involved a lot of people, it required a heavy lift, and what you're doing is essentially subliminally reminding them how hard it would be to do this all over again. The third piece of that then is to quickly introduce the possibility of how then all that effort and all that progress that you've made, it could be put at risk if you decide to make a change. You're at a critical point in this journey, important to maintain momentum, because momentum is so hard to get, inertia is such a bitch. Now, how are you going to get off of that? Again, I inferred that, I didn't write that in there. Any change to this program, we've seen changes in midstream create some unnecessary risk. Then the next was to highlight the cost of change. Remember this idea that they perceive change is the cost. Status quo is free. Well, let's let them know they're right. So, not to mention that bringing in another vendor at this point require you to invest this time and require to redo the implementation costs and all the changes, etc. Then the fourth piece was, the final piece was really important. If you remember, selection difficulty. This idea that admitting that you're kind of the same, and so it's not worth the risk of change. If I see enough contrast, I'm willing to make a change. If there's not enough contrast between the current state and the future state, and my selection is so difficult, I choose to stick with what I got. So here's the counterintuitive moment. We tested whether we should have a simple, breezy statement about how we've kept up with what's going on in the industry, or whether we should have a little bit more expanded detail on the kinds of advances we've made in the last 2 years and how that has continued to upgrade their program. And effectively, if you've been reading anything in the industry, you've started to see or hear certain things, don't worry. We've made similar advances. We've got you covered. So it's kind of a reference to, if you've been hearing about things or you've had like competitors knocking at your door, let's walk you through specifically the advances we've made, how those will roll into the next 2 years. But here's the key. Those advances that you're making must not introduce a new need. They must affirm and show the improvement that you're going to make on the existing needs, the reason they made this decision in the first place. So you want to be a little more elaborate and highlight a couple of improvements that you've made over the last couple of years that you believe will continue to influence this trajectory, but you want to speak about them in regards to improving the known stated objectives that we've been working on together the whole time, because it's not the moment to introduce something all that new and different. So even while these are new capabilities, you're not treating them as a disruption or a provocation. You're treating them as a, hey, don't worry, we've kept pace with the market. There's really not that much new or different out there. Why would you go through the risk of making a change? And these things we're talking about will continue to reinforce those objectives and move them to the next level. So, The exciting part about this, I think, is really twofold. One, there's a tested model now. When we go to build why change messages, sometimes we'll look at each other, and the one with the strongest opinion of what a why change message should be wins. There's actually a framework that we've worked with really smart people to test and validate, and I showed that to you earlier. Introduce the unconsidered need, show them the flaw in their current approach, show the contrasting new path that resolves that risk, and then tell them a great story of someone just like them before and after. Now we've tested and proven a new framework for the renewal message. That moment you're at renewal, that critical moment, and here's that structure. Document results to show the upward trajectory of the business partnership. Review the prior decision to help them see that the preferences they established should remain stable. Mention the risk of change to show them that the possibility of change and this idea of regret and blame is too high, that you should really, we're on a good path together. Show them that there's a cost associated with change, so they realize that what they've done is made an investment, and that investment is now running well. It's already sunk, and it's already making, the investment is starting to pay back versus doing that over again. And then show them by detailing your advances during the last 2 years that you've kept pace with the market. There's really not that much daylight between you and the competitors, so why would you take on the risk of change? So now, instead of going into renewals messaging meeting and having people share opinions about what they think you should do, you've now got a structured format that has been tested and proven. And I give that to you today. Here's where the work we did with Demand Gen Report came into being, because this is why I thought this was such an important dialogue for us to have in the era of ABM and the era of lifecycle messaging. And that is that this idea of demand generation, why change, new business acquisition has kind of become our obsession. But the opportunity for real money is in the renewal phase, because now we can start making some money on this customer because they're sticking around long enough to pay back all that we put into it to get them in the first place. Really bad time to lose them. Critical to your growth, that especially if it's a subscription company, that base stay there so that all your new customers are incremental, accretive, as opposed to your back door being as wide open as your front door. So this is important. But here's what we discovered. When we ask people like yourself in this survey with Demand Gen Report, how much of your budget, so think of your marketing, messaging, and content budget, campaign budget, is spent on renewal or retention-related activities. Nearly half of the companies, some of you might have taken this survey, nearly half spend less than 10% of their budget, time, and effort on the renewal side of the conversation, the why stay side of the conversation. Only a fifth spend somewhere in the ballpark of 30%. But when you think about your opportunities for growth, to maintain, close that back door and keep those customers there and give you something to add to, that base is super important. The opportunity for growth to keep them versus trying to get another new one. And only 1/5 of companies spend maybe 30% of their effort on that. The other piece of interesting was that marketing, and now I know there's more than marketing here in the audience, but the thing about renewal messaging is it's very fragmented. Who's in charge? And the risk is that some people might be in charge who are not communicators, who are not strategic messengers, who don't understand the power of proven frameworks and the value of that. And here what you see is roughly half of all companies don't even involve marketing in creating renewal messaging. Somebody else is doing that. And you just hope if they're in customer service or account management or sales that they're telling a good story and the right story. Marketing, on the other hand, 75% kind of own demand gen in the classic new business acquisition. Only 19% have marketing as the primary owner of renewal type messaging. So there's an opportunity, I think, in terms of you looking at the life cycle. But now you can go in not kind of guessing and saying, we're strategic marketers, so we should own this. You can go in saying, we have a framework, tested and proven, that can help here. But this is interesting because we asked then the question, should the messages actually differ? Because we're hearing a lot in the marketplace about provocation-based selling, insight-based selling, challenge your customers. And so the question is, should we challenge them all the way through the life cycle? I would tell you that our research says no, that there's an opportunity to create a likelihood to change, switch, possibly not renew, if you happen to provoke them at the wrong time. But 58% of people believe we can use the same message and same messaging approach. One of the big reasons is just not enough time and resources to change it. I would argue the other reason is you don't know what to change it to. But now you do. Now you have a tested, proven framework to work this out. So, those of you who say, yes, these should differ significantly, maybe you didn't know what to do yesterday, you just knew it needed to be different, I'll give you this framework. Those of you who thought they should be the same, I give you these test results saying, no, they shouldn't, here's a framework. What's interesting is then when we ask people, if you were to imagine how they should be different, how should they be different? And 36% said we should regularly challenge our customers with provocative industry insights. 31% said we lean heavily on product-oriented cross-sell and upsell. And only 1/3 said we reinforce our value, emphasize the time, the cost, the risks, the difficulties of changing their situation and moving to a different vendor. So in effect, intuitively, about 1/3 of you get where you should go with this messaging, at least according to the test we did in the framework that has been constructed. So I think there's a huge opportunity here for us to be in the market together, communicating across the customer life cycle, but understanding that the science of buying decisions. So when I work on this, I look at social psychology, behavioral economics, and neuroscience, and triangulate those things, and then never get invited to any dinner parties. And triangulate those things and realize that in acquisition, it's not about why you. It's not about why you, it's about why change. And it's really change management principles that you invoke in your messaging and content, not traditional value props. And that is the idea that you must defeat the status quo, and there's a science to that. And we talked about that today. But as you move to a customer and now feel like to keep the marriage alive, you have to keep introducing all of these frisky different things, the reality is maybe you need to be reinforcing the status quo bias, because when you are the status quo, you want them to stay biased towards you. So that's the opportunity we have today. So working together with Demand Gen Report, we've captured everything you heard today in a report, and that link down at the bottom gets you that report. So I'm going to leave that up for a minute as I kind of close us out. That link will get you that report. If you don't get it and it's not clear, you can go by our little booth where the books are, and you can get scanned, and we will send you this ebook, and we will send you the slides from today's presentation. So literally tomorrow, you can do something different with the frameworks that we learned here today. That's our gift to you. This is all about you tomorrow being a little bit smarter and more effective than when you came in here. Hopefully, that is what we accomplished today. So be on the lookout for why change, and not just why stay, but also why pay. We are running studies in the next quarter where we're going to construct a framework. We have 6 conditions we're testing, 6 different frameworks on the best way to introduce and launch a 4% price increase. And we hope by the next time we talk with you that we're going to be able to talk about why change, why stay, and why pay. So stay tuned. Thank you very much.